Welcome back. Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene seems to have hit the right chords with his first main budget speech. Economists and experts say the speech struck a balance between spending, tax and cutting waste. However, opposition parties say he should have looked at cutting corruption instead of raising personal income tax. Economist Xanti Payi joins us in the studio to give us a breakdown on the minister's speech. Good evening, Xanti, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, let's break this down. Aside from the usual rise in sin taxes, petrol, electricity and income tax going up, what are the positives and negatives from the minister's speech?
Look, as you said, he tried very hard to balance it out. For the longest time, we've been expecting tax breaks, and we all have come, to be used to that extra 100 rand or so when we, after the budget speech. So that is not really going to be coming for most people anyway, particularly the high earners. But certainly he touched everywhere. He tried as far as possible to hit the right kinds of things about infrastructure, what we need to do there. I think some of the things that were a bit dicey, because part of the problem in South Africa is not so much how much you have and how much you have to spend in particular, but how we actually implement that spending. And that's one of the difficulties. So one of the things he said was trying to centralize, in this discussion about corruption, centralize government spending, so to say, look, we'll procure from a central point, which might prove more difficult actually than just being said.
Now, let's speak on the issue of job creation. 2% growth. Where are the jobs going to come from?
And really, it's not that encouraging. 2% growth. But one of the things you have to do in order to create jobs is to actually start spending. So, for example, if he talks about, infrastructure, making sure that we are spending on various aspects. As we spend, we create employment. Remember, if government spends money on building a road, they hire people to build that road. And as they hire people to build that road, those people go home and they spend that money on education or bread. And the person who owns a spaza shop spends that money on buying maybe a bakkie. And that bakkie obviously means that it's built in South Africa, hopefully. And those kinds of things. So that one rand goes a long way, and that usually creates jobs. Where the problem has been is how we actually spend money, if that is efficient rather than leaking out of the system.
Now, let's just touch on the issue, on the fact that the minister has spoken about a 2% growth. Now, looking at targets, for instance, development goals for 2030, most economists say that we have to be at a 5% growth development for the country to meet our targets. What happens in the interim? How do we get to that point where we are able to meet these development goals?
Look, there's some interesting things to be done there. So one of the things he mentioned is our trade with the rest of the continent. He said, South Africa's trade, even though we're struggling with our international partners in terms of, Europe and the US and everybody else, certainly with the rest of the continent, that number is growing in double digits. What we need to do is actually to enhance that. One of the things we need to do, for example, is the infrastructure that's necessary, the roads, the railway lines, and the ports that allow us to export more, and the partnerships that we build with the rest of the continent, because that's where the growth really looks like it will be coming from. So that's one space, and that we can create jobs from that front. Certainly we need to be a little bit more braver, even in terms of some of the things that we're taking. So the tax increases was a brave point, because we need more money, and you're saying let's go to the richer guys, and people, the government has been very, very sensitive about that, because they think if you increase taxes for the rich or the high earners, they will stop spending or they will stop investing in the country. And actually evidence shows that actually the opposite effect exists. People in the US who have been looking at this are saying, look, actually you can tax more so that you can invest in your economy. So that is partly much braver. And obviously one of the issues we have, and he reflected this quite seriously, which is we need to talk about the power sector. That is causing severe, severe damage. And that's where actually, if we're looking to create jobs, we need to actually focus.
Now, Xanti, some experts say the minister should have provided more detail on government plans to reinvigorate, as you say, the country's electricity woes and improving its performance. 23 billion is going to be allocated to Eskom, I think from, around June?
June, yeah.
Now, what are your views on this?
Look, the government came out last year when, we started experiencing these problems, and they said, listen, we have a 5-point plan. And then, the president at the State of the Nation didn't really reflect on that as much as he should have. And certainly the minister talks about the money and a little bit of taxing more. But what's the actual plan? Remember, one of the things that we're facing now is deterioration in some of the generators, the late coming on board of the new power station. So he's like, what is actually the plan? Step by step. Certainly, we need to hear that a little bit more. But I suspect there's certainly a lot of the things that they don't themselves know in terms of how to go forward in this, including some of these things they've talked about in terms of nuclear energy, diversifying into national energy. So there's a lot of stuff that clearly isn't out there that they need to work out. But certainly we need both a short-term plan, but more importantly, a long-term plan around this thing.
Now, we've been here before as a country, and electricity has given us a problem where we experienced load shedding before. What should be done differently from an economist's point of view to deal with this problem?
Look, I think it's a general problem that we face in South Africa. So we like short-term goals and short-term gains, like what can you do now? But if you think that for all the things that we need to do across infrastructure or across all the problems, including education, when we started early and we didn't actually look for short-term gains. So if we had started, for example, in 2000 and not looked for short-term gains and said, look, we've got a 10-year plan and this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to monitor it, we'd be far now. And we need to take the bullet now and be brave and say, look, we will experience some pain for some time to come, but this is the plan. We are, bringing in external skills if we need to. We've got a plan locally and across the board in terms of also bringing in communities and educating them on how this can be done. There are, obviously pockets of excellence. We need to now leverage even on the lessons that we've learned. So we need a stronger plan that is much more than just a short-term plan and long-term plan. And for South Africans to buy into it and say, look, this is where we're going over the long term.
Now, Xanti, let's touch on the issue of an increase on social grants. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Look, it was rather marginal. I mean, talking about 30 Rand here or, somewhere. Look, obviously on the bigger scale, we need to ask ourselves, is it achieving what it's supposed to do? Now, if you look over the past 10 years, even the past 20 years, that number has increased amazingly. Now we have probably 16 million South Africans on social grants. We need to do more to say, how do we turn that tide? Instead of increasing the amounts and increasing the people who come into it, how do we do that? So, for example, we know, for example, young girls continue to be pregnant. Some of them actually fall pregnant to gain access to the social grant. But how do we turn that around to say, we're actually now at a point where less and less people are being on the social grant, even though we increase maybe how much it is, but essentially we're taking people out of it as they gain employment, as they are able to buy their own housing, and they're able to sustain themselves.
Now, Xanti, finally, would you say this budget is a budget for the poor?
It is in some ways, because it actually says, look, we can take some money now from the rich and say we are going to give it to the poor in terms of actually building some of the basic things. I mean, he talked about education, very, very importantly. He talked about health, which is very important, which are the things, and service delivery, which are the things that the poor really need. So he used the word social solidarity, which is very important. It's saying, we are in this together. So the rich must do whatever they can to help the poor. So that sounded as if it was going in that direction.
Xanti, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was our studio guest, Economist Xanti Payi, giving us some insight on the Finance Minister's budget speech. More news coming up after the